Okay, today I want to talk about migration and development, specifically about remittances, and I've got the next week's tutorial for here. You can collect when we go, or tomorrow. That's specifically on diasporas. I'm not sure who's doing remittances and who's doing diasporas, but they follow on. Who's doing diasporas? Anyone here? Remittances? Okay, all our mystery people. Okay. So today's lecture, specifically remittances. Thursday I'll do diaspora specifically, and they relate overall. The concepts very intertwined. So they'll help explain what we're doing overall. But today, remittances. And there's quite a good report on remittances, financing for development, etc. World Bank Report 2015. I've taken some of the graphs from there. Migration is now increasingly seen as a positive factor in development. It's a new orthodoxy, if you like, in terms of it's a different way of thinking. It was always seen as negative and put in the context of brain drain. More specifically now, human capital used in foreign countries. It's used as a form of exchange, if you like, with flows of people, flows of money. It's been wound up in terms of being a more positive take on what the destination as well as the origin country can gain out of migration. And one of these forms, most notable, is remittances. The remittances that are sent home from migrants are seen as one of the benefits of the migrating, and it's very much tied in with a lot of this temporary movement with people, well, working somewhere else for a while and then going back to their home countries. Look at foreign direct investment, FDI, and in some cases remittances have become more important than foreign direct investment. They're seen as bridgeheads for export, meaning these ties and relationships that are set up between countries where you have high proportion of migrants and linkages to the home countries. And social remittances is seen as an information transfer or a diffusion of ideas and skills back to a home country, as well as just in terms of being able to do business or interact with those countries. Return migration, you can see it down there. Return migration also is an important aspect. How do you encourage some of your migrants or diasporas overseas just not to send money, information back? Hopefully they'll return to the home countries with their skills and improve not only the human capital of those countries, but clearly social interaction, networks as a two-way stream, or the linkages between countries. Remittances and capital flows to developing countries 1990 to 2017, obviously estimated for 2017, the dotted lines anyway. The red line is foreign direct investment, and you can see this is over the last decade, it's been increasing, but it also fluctuates. The blue line is remittances, which seems to be an upward trajectory generally, and this is the anticipated continuation of that trajectory. This is private debt and portfolios, equity investments. Again, they obviously much more fluctuating trends. A real dip here around 2001, but clearly a rise, but then they're not as secure or stable, obviously. Global flows of international migrant remittances. These are billions of dollars, by the way. This is 1995 up to estimates for 2010, and they are rubber figures because they are estimates, and they're underestimates generally. About 101 billion back here overall remittances to all developing countries. You'll see in both contexts quite significant increases in billions of dollars over that period they're tracking here. And outward remittances flows. Obviously they're much smaller from the developing countries, but clearly remittances are big business. Lots of money flowing out and into countries. This is from the Migration Development Brief, which I'll put in your reading for next week, so I just want to take a bit out of it. Migrants' remittances, developing countries estimate to reach 436 billion in 2014, a 4.4% increase over the 2013-11. All developing regions recorded positive growth, except Europe and Central Asia, where remittance flows contracted due to some deterioration of the Russian economy and depreciation of the ruble. In 2015, however, the growth expected to moderate sharply, however, and slow down in East Asia and Pacific, Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. The positive impact of flows of a robust economic recovery in the US will be partially offset by continued weakness in Europe, impact of lower oil prices on the Russian economy, the strengthening of the US dollar, and tighter immigration controls in many source countries for remittances. Remittance flows are expected to recover by 2016 to reach 479 billion, in line with a more positive global economic outlook. So they're a big money spinner in terms of globally and particularly impacting on some countries. The large countries receive most remittances, which is logical. Biggest populations are going to have the biggest remittances, but the small countries are often also even more dependent. So clearly India and China, this is billions of dollars, 70 billion, 64 billion, Philippines, Mexico, Nigeria, Egypt, Arab Republic, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Vietnam and Lebanon. So clearly the two biggest world populations have the two biggest remittance amounts basically. Percent of gross domestic product in 2013, you'll find some of the smaller countries very much, Tajikistan 49%, almost 50%, Nepal, Tonga, Armenia, etc., roughly about 20 to 30% of their economies. Remittances as a share of GDP, even amongst those large countries, recipients, China 64%, Philippines, Vietnam, obviously making a huge impact on some of those countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. As percent of GDP, you'll find a lot of Pacific Islands and the Philippines, Vietnam, Fiji, Vanuatu. Again, very important to their economies, made up of remittances coming back into those countries. Some of these small Pacific islands have a large number of contract workers, and remember they're relatively small populations, so it looks larger on a smaller population base. Several African countries are highly dependent also on remittances. These are all African, about 20%, down to about 5%. And the percentage of imports into those countries, which is this sort of money coming back, clearly is playing quite a large role in all of their economies. So a lot of the remittances are coming back from contract labour migration, not just people permanently going and settling somewhere. Contract labour migration, basically that major form of migration in the Asia Pacific. So that's why those figures are looking really large amongst some of those countries. Indonesia, Fiji, Vietnam, they have got a lot of contract workers working elsewhere and sending their money back home. Usually involves about 2 years, and it's mostly unskilled or low skilled labour. Okay, so they go on a contract, they're recruited on those contracts to fill jobs. They can be in factories, they can be for domestics, they can be for care workers, it can be a whole range of roles, and we'll talk about this a bit later, when a lot of them are women contract workers involved in that movement. They usually travel without family, they are single contract workers. It involves middlemen or agents. These middlemen in particular arrange visas, arrange travel, arrange the jobs. They usually work with the employers or big companies, and in other words, they are contracted to fill obligations, work obligations within these countries. Those middlemen can be good eggs or bad eggs in terms of what they charge, because they have their fees, but they also, until they get their money paid back, often take passports away. They don't have free movement back to where they're going, or they are bonded or contract. For women, that can be pretty desperate if something happens and they get sick or they get pregnant by unscrupulous employers and things. It gets very nasty. And the reading I've given you from one of the tutes, it shows also contract workers, if they get things like HIV/AIDS, they'll get deported straight away. And so it's not a very nice business if you don't conform to some of the rules. It's a major source of income generally for the households left behind, because the household is generally left behind, or families left behind, and it's basically increasing a major source of country earnings, those earnings we're talking about, as part of GDP. However, we've got lack of really accurate data, and it's usually underestimated, because clearly there's a lot of not formalised contracts, not formalised money flows as well. Estimated stocks of foreign labour in Asian countries around 2004. What's a stock of migrants? What's the stock mean?
The number of migrants on a certain place. And it's like, for example, now the stock of migrants in Australia would be the number of migrants in Australia now.
Yeah, so it's within the country, and we usually get that from a census, but on overseas contract workers there's usually memorandums between countries of how many contract workers have been traded or whatever. So, and again, it's a rubber figure, it's what's in their official documents, but it's where they are, like the stock. And yes, they're about 10 years old now, but the patterns are basically the same. So Japan's got 870,000. They're not big on foreigners, remember, but they're willing now to take contract workers. South Korea 400, Taiwan, Malaysia over 1 million, Thailand 2 million, Brunei 91,000, Hong Kong 216,000, China relatively small, Vietnam 90,000, Indonesia about 90,000, Philippines small, about 9,000. Most of their migrants are somewhere else, they're forming a stock elsewhere. So obviously to try to get those stocks of migrants is important for us to see exactly where some of these, they're mainly foreign contract workers basically are. This is in the Gulf countries in particular, where they've been recruiting strongly. Qatar and places, Saudi Arabia, that's their labourers, that's their construction workers. They have up to 80% of those populations born overseas. So if we look 1985, and then up to 2005. You can see in all these cases those stocks of foreign labour have actually been increasing, doubling in lots of cases, or more than that, tripling. Some going down, but no, I don't know. I think they're all going up. Just ignore the fact they haven't got the zeros on those columns. My typist that did this a while ago, obviously she didn't fit it all in across that table. Stock of Filipino overseas migrants in December 2004. The red means permanent in this circle. The circle is indicating how large the stocks of Filipinos overseas actually are. If we take the USA, it's a very big stock. The red means they're mainly permanent, the yellow is temporary, and the blue is irregular. Australia, the Filipino workers overseas, stock of Filipinos in Australia are basically permanent, and same with New Zealand. But you'll see through Europe, and that a lot of them are temporary workers, obviously working in Asia and the Middle East and across Europe. Basically, this migration development debate, the brain drain perspective began in the 60s, was very strong in the 60s and 70s, and probably through the 80s as well. It was seen as a negative context brain drain. We were taking people away, and that was also aligned with the permanent migration traditional approach that people left countries and settled elsewhere. It really wasn't until late 80s, 90s that you really saw a change in that debate, that it wasn't just brain drain, but clearly other things had changed, much more temporary movement, much more benefits being seen going back to the countries. It was seen generally as a net loss of human capital in poor countries. So the poorest of countries tended to be losing their human capital essential for their development. So yes, in a context of traditional migration where they moved and stayed in their host countries, it probably was in terms of looking at it in that way. But we have to remember the world changed, the whole dynamics of migration changed. Low-income countries, the fact that low-income countries were gaining foreign capital and trade links as well as people links was not recognised as part of development strategy. And it took a while for that to basically change, even when it was happening over a number of years. Remittances were flowing all through this period. We could argue, are they a good or a bad thing? And that argument goes up right up to today. You'll still see arguments 2 and 4 remittances. This graph map is showing, and undoubtedly it's a brain drain, and so therefore it is likely to prompt negativity, if you like. These are physicians per 100,000 people, 1990 to 2004. And where are all the physicians? Yeah, all through here. Australia, South America, North America got their share. So clearly, where the big populations are, it's not a ratio to the same extent, for example, as physicians. Or you could pick any other specialist group and probably find the same pattern. Australian health workforce, as 2011 census, we don't have the new census finished yet, let alone the results. From that census, you could tell 4.5% of your health professional workforce was born in Africa or the Middle East, 14% born in Asia, and overall over a third overseas born. Okay, so that is quite high in terms of we're obviously importing the health professional workforce. and I'll say more about the workforce and breaking it down a bit later. These remittances figures, which is what I'm trying to concentrate on here, are partial because people often bring back money personally. They travel home with money, don't necessarily send it through official channels because they lose a percentage of that money generally through the official channels. Some countries actually tax remittances, money going through bank accounts. Some countries have actually changed policy at the moment and are very much more liberal. They're actually giving higher rates to people sending up, higher interest rates, people investing at bank accounts. Money can be taken by visitors. Visitors going home will take money or gifts for other people. Informal systems to transfer money, not through the general banking systems, but there's all sorts of other carriers. Some bring back gold as goods. Does anybody? I often used to wonder why there were all these shops, often near airports, but in markets and everywhere, selling a lot of gold, heavy gold chains, just gold, anything. And it's another way they can get money back to, well, valuables back into the country through earnings. And that definitely doesn't get taxed and doesn't get seen as well. And they generally try to avoid the high costs of money transfers, so they avoid sending it through money brokers and Western transfers, etc. 6 different companies will charge different money. Some companies will send it straight direct back to refugee camps even, or wherever it's going, and some basically it's a bit more difficult. So we only get to see part of that remittance money, because it also and also goods like, I guess, electronic goods now, all the handheld whatever would be going back as well, and that's not seen as payments in any way. Why were remittances neglected in the past? Generally there was underestimation of them and they weren't going through proper banking channels. Many went through those informal channels like visitors or money transfer companies, not necessarily very reputable ones. A lot of countries just saw it to be spent on consumption and little benefit to national development, meaning, okay, those households were receiving money from outside, but clearly wasn't adding much to the general development of the country. Now countries can see some of the advantages and see the billions of dollars. They're encouraging remitting through banks. Some of the fees been reduced, some of the taxes reduced on that money. Some not. I was hearing the other day where they were actually taxing remittance money at a higher rate. Growth of remittances, just a couple of countries here, but all of them are seeing quite a dramatic rise through the last decade or so. And you'll see this is Philippines, Pakistan, Thailand's been high for some time, and Indonesia's really in this market too of high remittances going back to the country. Advantages of remittances. Generally, it goes direct to households. So a foreign direct investment or overseas aid doesn't necessarily go directly into households. That assists in the consumption of food, goods, housing, investment, building their own houses, improving their homes, or building their homes, or investing generally in buying a home and property, and education, particularly of the children. So it's going directly into that household. Generally, households obviously who have an overseas worker overseas able to remit money. Generally, second and third round impacts, if these workers keep going to countries to work, are seen as multiplier effects. After a time, they have spin-offs in the local communities, and so therefore clearly allowing some development to occur outside the households. Introduces people to the formal financial system, and they've seen advantages of doing that now because governments have been involved in making banking easier, investment easier, and giving them higher interest rates sometimes on money coming back into the country if they send it back through the banking system. Generally reduces poverty in communities, and there is potential for development investment. But some of the critics have been saying, well, it mainly goes into the households for their personal benefit, consumption, security, education and health, etc. and housing. What benefits are there for development? Increasingly, governments have seen these investments and trying to facilitate them. Generally, money is earned in high-cost places and it's spent in low-cost places. So if you earn a lot of money in a high-cost area, because that's where you're getting your high wages, but sending it back and it's actually getting spent, you'll go further in your low-cost places, advantaging your families and the country. Obviously, there's a spin-off in goods. But the argument is that some of those people buy imported goods, not local goods, so it doesn't really help the local domestic market. Diversify portfolio of family earning possibilities, expands on if you're dependent on agriculture, for example, and maybe they get a business, a small enterprise business, with the money being sent back, or when they come back they might own a taxi or a trucks, and that can expand their livelihood to actually providing something within the community, or providing trucks, carting, agriculture. In other words, they're not reliant just on the crops or whatever they're growing locally. Reduces risk of failure of family finances, protects against the poor seasons. They could have other jobs to do, or they can actually go back working overseas. There is no social security generally in these countries. Government support, so you're providing your own backup money. That's where they're also trying to make them save and invest, or let's say encourage them. They're seen as insurance against the impact of calamities like Asian tsunami, Nepal or earthquake, to have this pool of money that's coming from outside the country as a backup to some of these families. The issues that cause the most debate, unfortunately, you can understand, increases income inequality in the short term, those households that have overseas workers and those households that don't have overseas workers. So if it's mainly going into consumption patterns within households, surely the ones missing out are becoming more unequal, if you like. Their children's education, their health, welfare, everything will differ. So there's arguments they don't like that income inequality, and how can that be levelled out? Well, it basically can't. And can increase dependency. So households back home say, I don't need to work very hard, I'm going to rely on this money coming from overseas. And if that stops, like construction workers in the Middle East and places, they lose their jobs, they come back to families who basically haven't really been earning income while they've been away, and so therefore agricultural income and things like that. So it can cause, let's say, laziness amongst those dependent households. There's social effects of family separation, a lot of social issues, and we'll talk about them a bit more when we talk about gender and migration, because a lot of these women, contract workers going out from Sri Lanka and a lot of countries, are leaving behind husbands and children. More jobs sometimes overseas for the women than there is for the men. So they're left home and they don't become really excellent mothers. And it's transnational mothering is the term, and it's getting better because of improved communication technology. But remember, they're away for 2 years generally, and they've been leaving young children behind. And it's often the grandparents or the aunts and uncles are responsible, or it could be both the couple working as well. So social effects, high divorce as well on separation, a lot of drinking of the males evidently home. Anyway, we'll get to that. Females are better sending their money home than the males anyway. Rent taking, that means your middlemen, agents, people taking money to get them to places, to get them visas, to get them settled, to get them jobs. So that rent taking can take up quite a lot of your income as well. And consumption versus investment spending is what the government wants to try to encourage, investment for all the community, not just consumption, better consumption for some households and not the others. And it's understandable if those households are doing much better within small communities that aren't having much other government support, well, there must be issues. Some communities, quite a lot of money going to the church and other organisations, but that's probably coming from diasporas, the better off diasporas than from remittances. Remittances and regional development. We talk about countries and remittances, but unfortunately there's regions within countries. They come from particular regions. Your recruiters and agents go to particular regions to recruit workers, and therefore the remittances get concentrated in those areas as well. So okay, they're taking migrants from particular areas, recruiting the areas, they get to know people in those areas, and they therefore reinforce this problem. Some regions do far better than others because they have this potential of overseas workers and money going home. This regional development aspect is generally neglected in regional plans, development plans for certain areas, and often migrants come from poor or peripheral areas, generally neglected by central governments. So this is where I'm saying the recruiters go to areas they know are desperate to send people overseas to work. Now generally reliable, good workers they discover, so they'll go back there and keep reinforcing this pattern. And again, I was talking about detrimental to some households and not others within an area, but some regions benefit and others don't. They are not sourced. People, either the recruiters don't know them or they don't have the contactors, so some areas do much better out of this than others. Policies on remittances, and this is where governments have seen the benefits now, and they try to maximise the inflow of remittances from overseas workers and other citizens and former citizens overseas. So that's your diaspora, people that have gone settling permanently overseas, not just contract workers. How do we plug into those networks and actually try to maximise the benefits of the money coming back? They've tried generally to organise money into the formal banking sector, and so recipient households use them in ways which enhance national development priorities. Money in the bank can then be used for wider development. So bring it through the banks, invest rather than spend all of it as well. First priority of migrants to family, so non-migrant households often lose without regional efforts to direct those overseas earnings into community developments. And that's what a lot of governments now have realised and are trying to do something about it. That's because they're trying to formalise the banking system, get people to invest in money through the bank, and instead of taxing that money, they're giving them incentives or higher interest rates as well. This is some countries, not other countries. Policies to enhance the scale of remittances, reduce the rent taking on those remittances flow. So reduce the takings people are taking off the top. Governments like Indonesia have sought to increase skill level of out migrants to increase remittances. They've effectively tried to promote certain groups, skilled groups, to go and work, particularly contract work, and send money back because it's going to be more money coming in. Efforts to tax remittances have been unsuccessfully generally and not productive to a household economy. So the government themselves trying to tax the remittances to get cream off the top, perhaps, and give it back to the community or development. Need to direct a high percentage of remittances through official channels. They're trying to get more and more through official channels like money in the bank to invest than money just going into other forms, like I was saying, gold necklaces and all sorts of things. Some countries accept tax, others offer high interest rates and allow them often to keep it in foreign currency and establish national banks in migrant destinations. So all these things facilitate the greater retention of money that can be invested. This is money sent home, can be costly. The average, roughly global average, is about 8% creamed off. This is just cost of sending about $200 equivalent, meaning 8% would be lost to, let's say, charges to that money, roughly 8%. Some of these regions, Latin America, South Asia, Europe and Central Asia, MENA, Middle East, and also this is your Sub-Saharan Africa. Basically that's the highest, it's come down a bit, but clearly often the poorest of the poor sending back money are actually paying the maximum, creaming off if the tax on that money going back. Policies to mobilise the remittances for development, provide suitable financial products at origins, financial education to migrants and families, trying to educate them the best way to send their money back so they don't lose as much, and the best way to then invest or earn some money on their money back in the home country. Remittances being a basis for loans, which is a bit of a dicey business, but it does happen. Provision of training and investment, setting up small business. That's your small business like taxi or trucks or a shop or whatever, so that you've got another stream of income, you've got some of your money invested to go back and to work or build up some money, financial support. Integration of remittances into regional as well as national development plans. In other words, don't just talk at the national level, make sure regions that are very much targeted and untargeted regions try to share in some of the development coming back from overseas money. Now, we've been talking a lot about circular versus permanent migration. A lot of your remittances come from circular but also from permanent migration. What I was just talking about then was mainly contract workers, but poor and rich country migration. The temporary workers tend to be, in the developed world, more skilled, therefore more money, they earn more money, and so therefore they're going to be, I guess, better in terms of remitting as well as supporting development back home. So it's semi-skilled, skilled and unskilled, and we have Middle East and rich Asian countries as well now And that was a lot of your south-south migration. We're talking about differences within Asia and your Middle Eastern countries and your rich and poor within those contexts. There's a lot of controversy about unskilled migration. Little of that unskilled migration is going to OECD countries. Unskilled may remit generally more than the skilled, and that's a problem too. Why? Skilled migration is often trying to establish their own families and own money to be sent home if they're living in those countries. They'll need it. Arguments for circular versus temporary movement, higher development effects of remittances and return migration, meaning they're going back to these countries and bringing back not just their money but ideas and the way of doing business and general diffusion of different ways of doing things. Filling increasing labour demand caused by shortage in developed countries of unskilled, skilled workers, that might be relatively short term. So maybe this is where they're trying to go back or should go back in the longer term. Against, there's plenty of potential for exploitation, and that's what I said, some of those rent takers, middlemen, take passports away until you can actually pay back your money you're owing, let alone then trying to work and send back money back to family as well. Separation from family has very negative effects. Some countries, there's denial of rights, there's no rights within the country or labour force. High costs of travel and repayment of those loans to those middlemen. Do they displace workers at destinations? Meaning that they come in as contract work labourers. Labourers often on lesser incomes or lesser pay than local workers will get, and it also facilitates or fosters illegal migration. These people are set up for the legal industry, but they also know how to do all the tricks to actually of undocumented migration as well. As a result, there's unrealistic policies and programs to replace migrant workers with local workers, meaning they are very much contract workers, often for a cheaper price. This is a lot of the unskilled workers anyway. Overly restrictive entry policies which encourage proliferation of underground migration and marginalise migrant workers. Okay, they don't have the same rights, there's no policies to protect them in the labour force, and restriction of the rights of international labour migrants. So all those things, no right to have their family with them, no right to bring children with them because they won't have education, they won't get health benefits, etc. So there's all sorts of no-nos in there. Policies in origin countries, they need to improve governance, capacity building, combating the brain drain or ameliorating some of the bad aspects, mobilising the diaspora, and that's what I'll talk about Thursday. Whole idea of remittances and development, bringing them together to see that they can maximise some of that for development, strengthening of bilateral regional cooperation, need for best practice and obviously controlling those agents who may be recruiting in particular areas, promising things and maybe exposing certain groups to poor practice. Okay, in conclusion, I actually missed this slide here. Somewhere, no, it doesn't matter. This one, I think. Potential for migration, especially that of low-skilled groups, to deliver development benefits, are hampered by a reluctance in some countries to recognise the structural importance of migration, to address labour shortages for long-term economic policy and put in place appropriate migration systems. And I'm talking here about countries like Australia and other countries that are using some of these migrants, and particularly contract workers, as short-term. Much of existing migration, the potential for development impact is not being realised due to the siphoning off of migrant earnings through that excessive rent taking by recruiters, agents, moneylenders and other intermediaries involved in the migration process. So everybody sort of takes a bit of this money, and what that migrant is often left with, they have to live in another country, but they also have to provide money to support families back home. I've got a student working in this context. She is actually Tongan and she comes from Pacific Islands, and she's looking at contract workers in Australia. There are unskilled contract workers brought in now on a program to Australia, and they only usually come for 8 months or so of the year. They're seen as seasonal workers. And it's a bit criminal what some of the things are happening to them, because they actually have to, they get their wages deducted for superannuation, for example, because all workers in Australia have a compulsory superannuation payment from employers. They get money taken for rent, boarding, and their food and whatever. And that's all right if they work full weeks, but they don't always work the full week because they're in the fruit picking and other industries, and it's showing that they're going back with very little or sending very little home after the experience. And that's what this is basically saying. Be careful that, and that's because Australia is trying to ensure their rights, the same rights as everyone, and they're getting the same pay, but they're also getting deductions for their health insurance like students do, and all this other money coming out. I should get Lacey to give you a lecture at some stage, but it just really shows how much gets reduced because of conforming to what policy also is in some countries. In conclusion, sorry, I just knew I didn't do that. Remittances are now an essential part of the global economy, particularly for poor countries. Flows of migrants accompanied by flows of capital. So they become an integral part of the economy, and for some households, essential for their well-being, and clearly how much that spins off to the rest of the community is what is trying to be ameliorated. Now encouraged as part of development strategies put forward by governments. Okay, governments themselves are encouraging this, but are they a long-term solution? In how long will the shortages in a lot of these more developed countries or rich countries going to work or last for? So what is the longer-term outcome for households, particularly those dependent or reliant on remittances? And does everyone benefit? How do non-migrant households benefit from some of this process? Is there a way that can be made to work better? Okay, so remittances, I particularly talked about them today. Then I'll talk about some of the diaspora content and how that relates to the development nexus as well. Thursday. And